All right, welcome to The Journey. My name is Rob Kepke, and I'm here with Mark Meszaros from Digital Industry. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being on here. I'm really glad we could finally sync up and sit down and have a conversation about kind of where you've been, where you're at now, because from my understanding, it's a pretty awesome journey, and I'd love to dive in and learn more about that.
It's had its moments.
Yeah. Awesome. So where I'm going to have you start, and actually where we'll start is, let me just have you give a little bit of context of Digital Industry, when you guys started, what you guys do. Let's start there.
Sure. Well, the way I usually describe Digital Industry is that we service businesses predominantly in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore metro areas. Most of our clients tend to be what we consider small to middle-sized organizations. That definition varies between folks. So I say 10 to 110 in size. The majority of our clients tend to be about 20 to 50 person organizations. And for those organizations, we're their complete outsourced IT services department. We do, of course, have the extremes of that. We have clients that are smaller than as described, and then we have a number of clients that are also significantly larger that we deal with on a global level. So we do have all those different size clients, the bulk of which are represented by what I described.
Awesome. And you guys started when?
The company is now 22 years old. That is, the company I've been in leadership of is now 22 years old. Over the years, we have acquired, we have sold components, and so the name in that journey has changed. So we started out as IntestNet in '98 and became Digital Industry in 2006.
And you are like founder, like this was you from the beginning.
It was.
And what sparked that? Like what made you decide to start a business when, I think back then, I say back then, but it's easier to start businesses now, in my opinion. Maybe you have a different opinion about that, but I think it's also, just in general, starting a business is a big risk. It's not for everyone. And I guess what made you decide to take that plunge?
Well, I would agree that there are a lot of tools and facilities today that allow you to start a business, even starting out at a very low risk position, comparatively speaking, and represent yourself to be quite large. And the cost to do so today is probably a bit lower than it was when we got started. The facilities that we had to use at the time did mean that we had to put down some money, but we did start predominantly with sweat equity.
Awesome. Very cool.
Suffered through a first year that probably didn't meet the same financial equivalencies as the jobs that we left to start the company. So, for me, my family has started businesses throughout my entire life.
Awesome.
I joined before I was in a position to start IntestNet, which became Digital Industry. I joined my father at US Africa Airways. It was an airline my father started with a group of other men while I was still finishing up college, and gave me the opportunity to work with some men who were in significant prominence in the aviation industry.
Wow.
I learned a lot just by being in their presence, and everything from that venture funding to putting together the business plans to succeeding and failing in different attempts over the years that it took to get that venture funding in place and to get literally that business off the ground. And then also the process to watch that grow, succeed, and then fail. That was also an amazing teaching laboratory for me. I know for others around, for my father as well. Obviously, it's disappointing when a dream that you work on for unending years fails, but you do learn a lot from that. And so when I then, after US Africa, went forward and got into a place where I decided that starting my own business was what I wanted to do. I had not just the book learning and the time in school, but I had overlaid that with taking an idea from a basement office and turning it into 450 employees on 2 continents, and everything it took to put all that together. So that created a lot of understanding of boardroom politics, communicating, being transparent, business development and marketing, both successes and otherwise, that was there. So I had that to lay my head against when I was starting out, and that wasn't even our first business. U.S. Africa was my father's second. He was also a consultant in the aviation field, and that was his own business representing foreign carriers as their U.S. representative. And prior to that, he did have a career in the aviation industry. In the meantime, I also had worked for my brother, who started 2 businesses in the automotive space, and including where I worked during high school, which was in downtown Baltimore, where we had at the time, what you would have called a gray market dealership, i.e., we didn't call ourselves gray market. The automobile industry did that labeling. Basically, the exchange rates were such that you could purchase a European vehicle at a significantly less cost than purchasing the same car in the United States. And then even after the transportation of that vehicle to the United States, and then the conversion to EPA and DOT standards, which was a big part of what we did. Okay. That's where we created the value add. Anybody can go overseas, find a car, buy it, and ship it over. That's not that magical to pull off in the end. But the EPA and the DOT certification portion. So we dealt with Ferraris and Porsches and a lot of Mercedes and other vehicles like that during those years in my brother's business. Ultimately he left that business and went overseas. And then for me, and flowing back that journey then would be going back to school, going through college, going to U.S. Africa Airways, starting the airline, going through that experience, and then entering into the IT field. That was for me in school and at the airline, where I really made a transition from a activity that I did for friends and family and enjoyed as a hobby, building and repairing computer equipment. Was just something that I liked to do, and I hadn't actually thought of it as a career until the airline. It was within the time within the airline that I realized that even these remarkably well educated and experienced individuals that were in this startup leadership roles that my father surrounded himself with. This was an area of technology they just were not in their core competency. So when I heard the directions they were proposing, I stepped in, and being managers they looked at me and said, great, sounds like you know what's going on here. It's now your job. And I was, intrigued and enthused by that. I was in my young 20s. I didn't know how fearful I should have been of the task I'd been assigned. So ignorance was definitely bliss at that moment. And I pulled it off. Got the reservation system up, connected us to Swiss Air, connected us to United Airlines, connected us to American Airlines at a time before we used internet for these types of things, and got it all done so that we could, so that the IT side of the airline was an asset and not an encumbrance. Right. And then when the airline folded, I knew where I wanted to be as far as my career was concerned.
Yeah. So sounds to me it was self-evident that you were going to do your own thing.
I think at some point it was probably preordained. I mean, between my father and my brother and the other members of my family, extended and otherwise, I think it probably was just going to end up happening one way or the other.
Yeah.
And to that end, I should also say the final steps for me to leave the organization I was in and start the company also then did happen again through family. I had a brother-in-law who had venture funded a IT startup in Europe. He saw the things that we were doing and felt that those were things that would lend value to the efforts that he was making, and he asked if I wouldn't consider taking on some of those activities to help him, so effectively becoming our launch client. And it was very clear very quickly that it wasn't going to work successfully holding a full-time job and doing that as well. So my launch customer was effectively my brother-in-law's company overseas, who needed the skills and the abilities that we had here. And when I say we, I mean myself and two others that I was working, and we were the made up of the entire department for a large nonprofit in the city at the time.
Yeah.
And it was the three of us then that formed IntestNet right here in downtown Silver Spring, in a not quite so nice building, with just the money that we could scrape together.
Yeah. So do you, I guess going back even before all of that, so we kind of say this is preordained, self-evident, but are there even instances prior to, the high school working with your brother's business that you just showed characteristics of becoming an entrepreneur?
Right. Well, so things that I did in my youth, I guess there is something going on there because sometime in my 8, 9, 10-year-old ages, I became the donut delivery boy of the neighborhood I lived in. I would go out and after school, Monday through Friday, and walk the neighborhood door to door taking orders for Saturday morning delivery.
Awesome. I love that.
Yeah, and then my father, thank God for him, was willing to get up with me at 5:30 in the morning. At the time, there was an organization called Montgomery Donuts. I don't know if you have any recollection of those in the area, but to this day, I'm not aware of anybody who holds a candle on what they did.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they no longer exist, and they were right in reasonable distance from where we lived. And so we would go over and fill the entire car with dozens of boxes of donuts, and then drive around the neighborhood, starting at 8 a.m. in the morning, doing door-to-door donut delivery.
So you're like DoorDash for donuts before it even existed.
Right. I guess it was.
Or was, a glimmer in anybody's eyes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if I look back on it, honestly, thank God for my dad, because I think of the numbers of what we were buying and selling in the profit margin and otherwise. And I was like, if I look back on it now, really what I was just doing was figuring out a way to get that money out of my dad's pocket. The time we were done paying for gas and his time and my time, we did not have a good enough profit margin on that. But at 8, 9 years old, whatever I was like, rolling in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess he just wanted to encourage you, right? Because he had the entrepreneur fire in him, and he was just like, "Oh, I want you to just do it."
My father's father, before my dad emigrated to the United States, owned and started his own businesses. He lost them to, unfortunately, to the communist governments. When Budapest, Hungary, where my father grew up, changed, and when they became the communist countries that Hungary became, twice my father's father, what would have been my grandfather, lost his businesses because of that. Effectively, right. They took them over and took them away from him, and that impacted him tremendously. My father certainly, but also ultimately his father.
Right.
I never got to meet him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So somewhere along in there, it's always been, I guess, the path that we were going to start businesses.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I was doing the donut thing. I can tell you, I remember my dad talking to me about get out there and sell things and do things, son. I don't remember any conversations like that. That was just
Right.
like something that somehow just clicked, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go do this, and that's where I'd spent time thinking about the different products and things I was gonna do.
Yeah.
Was gonna do ice cream delivery. I had all kinds of ideas. I sold hats for a while, and then I read too. The donuts ran into a technical problem. I had some communication issues at one point with my supplier, Montgomery Donuts, and they didn't end up giving me the product that I was expecting. I guess that's what happens when you have somebody who's less than 10 years old on the phone ordering unending dozens of donuts. There could be miscommunication, and I don't know, some amount of many, many, many weeks, months into this, I had just a debacle. And I remember even at that age going, I'm done. I do not want to have to deal with this again. It turns out you may be under 10 years old, but when people don't get the donuts they ordered, they're not happy.
Still not happy. So I love this story because I think there's different viewpoints on people who are entrepreneurs. Are you born with it? Do you? Is it something you can learn over time? And in my opinion, which may be different from yours, is that yes, it is a skill set that can be learned over time. And it's...
I would agree.
Yeah, and from my personal experience, I've started multiple businesses where I just got to a point and I was like, I don't know what to do next. And so I just stopped it,
Right.
Things that started making money and you're just like, I don't know what to do. And it's just another learning experience and each one starts stacking up. And so I think we're seeing that thread come out in your story of, donuts was your lemonade stand, and then you got, to kind of maybe working with your brother, you didn't have the risk on your back, but you still were learning and seeing what was going on. Mm-hmm. Same thing working with your dad's endeavor and then starting your own stuff. And I'd love just to hear your thoughts on that a little bit more.
No, I would agree with you absolutely. Yeah, it is for sure a learned skill. The helpful portion of that comes possibly from the family is the culture of encouraging it. The culture, as I mentioned, my dad getting up with me at 5 or whatever it was in the morning and going and getting those donuts for weeks on end. I mean, he had a 9-to-5 job,
right.
And had to commute downtown DC, and there he was, pulling himself out of bed at that time of the morning to help me complete the obligations that I had made Monday through Friday walking the neighborhood. So it was the support for sure, and the culture and the family of being supportive of that. And that goes all the way down to little things that I recognized and also in relationships that I had when I was still acting very entrepreneurial, even if I wasn't starting full-fledged business. Like I spent many years effectively being an independent consultant to a variety of different businesses, doing different things, kind of gig economy before gig economy.
Right.
Where I would just, for this company over here, I had a fax machine at home, and they would fax me every time they needed me to do fireplace door installs. Right, and that worked during college and otherwise around even the airline, because then I had all the information I'd communicate with the end customer, go by the warehouse, pick up the materials, take it over. But I could, if they asked for an install time, I could say, I'm not available Monday and Tuesday, but I could be there Wednesday and such and such. So
right.
It was very flexible to me, and it allowed me to bring in additional income. But I was in relationships at the time, and a number of the relationships didn't have tolerance for those kind of things. And I remember a few times in relationships where there was, in fact, the opposite. There was like, why can't you just have a job like everybody else instead of doing this?
Yeah.
So if I had a family life that had been in that environment and culture, I probably wouldn't have tried to pursue entrepreneurial endeavors.
Right.
But I didn't. I had the opposite. I had a welcoming and supporting culture.
Yeah. And it was almost like that was, in some sense, more closer to the norm than the 9-to-5 piece because of it. Right. So you have these relationships where people are saying, like, why don't you get 9-to-5? And you're like, well, that sounds weird to me. Like, why would I do that when your whole life has basically been this, right?
It has, yes. And in fact, even now if we go back into this digital industry, I had all those different experiences. I had the corporate, the startup, the venture funding, the different businesses I ran, the successes, the failures, even down to all the way back to being, a 10-year-old. And then I went into the IT field, continuing the IT experience and profession. That I really turned from a hobby into something professional during the time of the airline. And then went back to school for those purposes, because now I decided that that's where I wanted to finish off and expand and add on to what I'd done in college. And then in that process, then sometimes life is also good to you, and sometimes you just, you walk into the opportunity that's just perfect, and as was the case for me at that time in 1994 or 5, was the internet was raw. It was a little Wild West. It was wide open. It wasn't yet the common everyday business tool, but it was trending towards a potential along those lines. It still was a little bit more, it still wasn't the common everyday tool by any stretch of what it is today.
Yeah.
And I was hired as somewhere in the first 10 employees for a small mom and pop internet service provider out of the Tysons Corner area. And they didn't have any business processes. They didn't have onboarding or offboarding documents in HR. They had nothing. So basically you had to go in and understand internet protocol, learn how it all functioned. You found yourself quickly on the phone with the likes of Sprint and other people who were, whatever level of experience those engineers had on the other side of the phone.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a sink or swim environment. And I had a really unbelievable learning experience. I look back at that and think of it for my IT career as I was a dry sponge, and they couldn't come at me fast enough, all the different pieces. At the same time, evenings I was in school for the same subject matter.
Yeah.
I was building my own systems in the evenings at home. By the time I was a year into being there, I'd started my own ISP. As I think about it, I was just family and friends connection, but nonetheless, I was building routers into my house and bringing in additional. I think I had like 10. It was all dial up at the time, except mine. I actually had a digital connection already by that point. That was a perk of being at the company.
Yeah.
And I had like I think I had like 10 to 15 telephone lines. 'Cause I was living back at my parents' home at this phase of my life. And I think I had 10 or 15 telephone lines coming into my parents' home. We actually had to.
Sure, they love that.
Yeah, they had to draw extra cable into the house to bring in all those analog lines for us.
Wow.
And then I was acting as an internet service provider for friends and family and folks. Yeah, it's, as I think about it, I was like, maybe actually it's a disease. I don't seem to be able to stop one way or another. Yeah, and then from there. One of the things that I recognized is that I was talking to people, particularly when I was talking to people at companies that we were acting as their first internet service provider. Mm-hmm. That the IT professionals, whether they were a few years in or whether it was clear to me that this person had a career in corporate IT, that the landscape had just shifted on them and a lot of them didn't even realize it.
Right.
And that what they had used up to that point, at least as far as the technologies, were irrelevant.
Yeah.
And the landscape had just shifted. And it shifted to the technology that I had just learned.
Yeah.
And that was going to be the future. And that was an incredible spot to sit at and go, I know the future. And I've been taught it. And then I combine that together. And so within, not including the time at the airline, which wasn't fully only consumed with IT. I had other responsibilities there too. I started my own firm in this space within 4 years. So it wasn't like I did a decade of IT experience and went there. It was basically I went through a shotgun internet protocol, internet services, and just leapt over, folks that were internal IT. They were still running things you guys don't even probably think about now anymore, internal local LAN broadcast protocols, NetBEUI, IPX, SPX, all kinds of different things that were big, giant pain in the ass to operate.
Yeah. So you were talking about, so you definitely sounds like you put your 10,000 hours in, right? Just getting to learn the IT landscape, right? And then on the flip side of it, you were able to catch this wave, internet coming up, right? And that's kind of, you were, in a sense, right place, right time. And, from our end, we see this a lot in the digital world. We see a lot of fortunes made off people who are running ads on Google right when it started, buying clicks for pennies and 5 cents, right? If you were first on SEO, first putting up blog content, you're able to ride that wave. Now it's, social media and putting out as much content as possible, right? And recognizing these waves. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that concept of, kind of this mix between just being the best at what you do, but also the importance, or not say importance, but the impact of recognizing trends that can basically accelerate a career, as kind of what happened in your case.
Yeah, I think it did. It's very interesting. I don't know that I can say that I've had other experiences where I can point out and say as clearly as I did that particular one, and that experience being at Case, it became clear to me, even in my naivety, as young as I was, that I was doing and learning things that were going to change the way that we were operating as a business community and a global community and otherwise. And frankly, I have to say, even Case and its ownership didn't have that completely, in my opinion, figured out.
Right.
It leapt me certainly forward. But if I just real quickly on the subject of Case, I think there were again so many different learning opportunities, not just in realizing that you're at the forefront of something that's about to take off and that it's going to slingshot you effectively forward. But then there was just the operation of Case itself. Their slogan alarmed me because I was very customer service oriented. Yeah. And their slogan was, "Where the clueful connect," as in they came. The owner and the head technician came from DARPA. He was a very talented engineer, but my takeaway was that he was really still looking at this as an exclusive community that it had been for most of his career, because he was really in the forefront, right? Within DARPA and the university and the government systems, they'd been using these, what we now call the internet protocols, but it was a closed community. And even though his business was now about connecting more entities to this construct, a slogan like that tells me he was still thinking of it as a closed community.
Of course.
And in the meantime, Rick Adams with UUNet was taking the same concepts. They were colleagues at one point, and as far as I understood, and he was taking venture monies and blowing it out and making UUNet into this global entity. Case grew also, but the difference between these two persons' approaches was remarkable to look at.
Right.
Now, I loved being at Case because I bet you at UUNet they had procedures and processes, and you were siloed into different things. There was none of that at Case. At Case, you sank or swam, as I mentioned earlier, and I loved that from a learning perspective.
It sounds like you thrived in that environment.
It was great. Also became clear to me that there were portions of the operation that were not enjoyed by others.
Yeah.
Running the modem banks was not something others wanted. They hadn't really assigned it to anybody, and it was done, but it was done begrudgingly. Okay. At least that's the takeaway, again, that I had. But it was a huge part of how the majority of our customers connected by volume. We did have customers that were the ones that were connecting over T1s at the time predominantly, and other similar types of connections, but those were the corporate clients, and then you had all the corporate clients who didn't do that, who were still doing dial-up, and all the consumers who were also doing it.
Right.
And they weren't being treated, I thought, in a respectful manner, because that you'd run into technical problems and nobody wanted to deal with them. So I took on the ownership. I stepped in and said, I'm going to take this over, and they said, fine. They were happy to let me take off on that, and so I started working very directly with Verizon. We had their equipment right in our facilities. We were allowed to go right up and into the Verizon equipment when we were making connections otherwise, so the learning curve again just blew out for me, because now I was doing things and being given toys and equipment to play with that was just outstanding as far as I was concerned, on that technical side. And then it also became clear to me that I wasn't going to stay here that much longer, that I had other plans. And so we were doing everything on equipment that was not your standard business equipment. We were running Sun OS, Solaris, Unisys. Again, a little bit more of that exclusive community at the time. They gave us Linux workstations, and so that was not where I knew I needed my practice for the next phases. So again, somewhat begrudgingly, I was granted permission to take equipment that was just laying around the place and build my own Windows, at the time, 95 PC. And a lot of the folks turned up their nose at the fact that I was doing this. But I later came to find that very frequently it was in heavy use when I wasn't there. So there were a lot of other people who were enjoying the Windows 95 machine and not doing that. So the story of Case for me, it was acquired by Clear Communications, the Auger Group. And then there was a lot of conflict between the old ownership and their immediate, most closely aligned staff, and that became an uncomfortable workplace then, and so I began looking to see where my next places would be, and then the folks from that new ownership came and asked if I would become the network operations center manager, and I declined it because I didn't feel like that was something, that I wanted to wade into. There was too much animosity between these two groups, the old ownership and the new ownership, and I was going to suddenly be promoted up over a whole lot of people who were my colleagues, or who were even people who were earlier in that first 10 employees than me. And I just didn't see that was going to work out as into a positive, enjoyable work environment. So I declined and headed out of that. So in any case, I think the slingshot effect of being in a place where you've learned these skills and everybody else is going to need them definitely puts you in a different place. So I, from there, quickly went to expand that with total intent on, I've understood the underlying telecommunications framework that all this is going to be working off of, or at least it is at this moment. And now I want to swing to the other side and implement and become the consumer at a corporate organization business level. And so that's the leap I made. That's why the Windows 95 machine, because I knew that was the platforms that I was going to start managing and going into, and I needed to prep myself and get ready for that type of environment. And that's why I did them. So I leapt then to the other side. We were then connected to the internet at the organization that I went to work for. So I became the consumer thereof and the manager of an organization that was a near government organization. So we had to have that deep internet connectivity, even though it wasn't a common business tool quite yet even. And it gave me that other consumer side. So by the leaping from the slingshotting for me was that I knew where I was going, and I started to map. I started to lay out the pieces of, okay, for me to go forward and do things in my future, I know this side of it, now I need to experience this side of it, now I need to experience this side of it. And that's how I did that that rapid, as you called it a moment ago, 10,000 hours.
Right.
Because I was conscious of the information and the knowledge that I was learning.
Yeah. And I guess you felt at a certain point, so going into it, that obviously wasn't the intention, but there was a certain point where the knowledge accumulated. And to me, it seems like there was just this focal point where it finally clicked for you, and you're like, oh shit, this is, I know enough now, and I see enough that I understand fully and can now map out where I'm going. And I guess the big takeaway for me and all of that is just, you going in, getting your hands dirty in something that you actually enjoyed, not with, maybe I'm wrong about this, but not with any intent of really what's going on in the future besides you just doing something you enjoy. But then when you started, kind of the fog started to settle, and you started to see things with more clarity about the industry, that's when, it took off. And you couldn't have gotten there without you just diving into something that you loved doing.
That's right. That's exactly what happened. I did not enter, and it wasn't hired on by case because of design. That was the dumb luck.
Yeah.
All right. And that was really, as far as I was concerned, I mean, again, some things in life happen with intent, and some things happen by stumbling into it. And that was the stumble into it, dumb luck portion of it. But once I recognized it, then, it all came together, because this is the work I like to do.
Yeah.
I enjoy this. It fulfills me at a lot of different levels.
Yeah.
So, I don't have a hateful experience when I go into work.
Yeah. But the prereq on that, though, was just you tinkering around, building a network for your friends and family.
Oh, yes.
Right? And so, again, just this whole, it's kind of just like stepping stones on top. You just loved doing this thing, you know? And then that flipped into a job with really no intent, and then that kind of transitioned into where you are now. And it was, again, just kind of this slow climb. And then seems to me what I'm saying is just then the fog clears, just rapid ascent at that point. In terms of the learning, in terms of,
It's true, but if I go back and were to be critical of self, there's other pieces of that too. Even as I speak of Bob at Case, and Rick Adams at UUNet, and Mark here at Digital Industry, not to put myself in the same level as those two guys, but I also suffered a little bit of what Bob, I believe, suffered from, and that was he was a technician who started a business and loved the technician side.
Yeah.
So if I were to go back and look at things from a critical eye, I'd say, even with all the business experience that I had through the different experiences with family members and father and brothers and otherwise in their businesses, I gapped on the fact that the business started well, and just by being competent, knowledgeable, we grew the business out to 25 staff and into gross revenue into the millions quickly. And from scraping together what it took to get going to that within 2-3 years.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. And then we had a somewhat horrendous market correction, and then we had the events of 2001. So we had kind of, for us as a business in the technology space, the market corrections in the earlier part of the year.
And that market correction, that's the bubble.
The bubble bursting. Yeah. And for me, what that meant was that my brother-in-law's company had to stop. His venture funding was gone, so there goes one portion of our revenue at the time. Yeah. We, in the meantime, had acquired other clients that were also venture funded. Well, all of these clients just went from like the faucet being on to the faucet being off through a series of phone calls in 1 week. Right. And so suddenly we were just left with all of the clients who are our local general IT services clients.
Yeah.
The specialization products that we were doing for these venture-funded entities were gone.
Yeah.
And now we're a generalist IT for our local clients.
Right.
That was an awful year. sometimes I look back on it and said I should have just shut the company down. It would have been maybe better than what we went through. But yeah, we went from 25 employees back down to 3 in the period of just over 6 to 9 months, and always too darn slow.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is one set of layoffs, and then another set of layoffs, and another set of, and they were always too slow. They should have come faster. But we were in a place where, like, we were writing proposals on napkins and going into big business deals with them. And otherwise, I mean, that's not, it's a little tongue in cheek, but I mean, we were closing almost 100% of anything we were writing as far as a proposal is concerned. And so if you took our percentages and otherwise and plugged them into our spreadsheets, and even after the market correction, wow, yeah, this is a big change and otherwise. But, and that wasn't ignored. It just was, we're like, great, okay, so we're not going to close 100% anymore, but, we should close 50%. And we didn't.
Right.
And that was a shock.
Yeah.
And that's why layoffs were too slow, because we anticipated a change.
Yeah.
Just the scope and the scale of it. I mean, we went from like closing 100% of everything to closing 10%, and they weren't even remotely the same size deals anymore.
Right.
So the 10% we were closing were these little dollar value items. Everybody froze up. The companies we were working for in the local area, the nonprofit associations, everybody just stopped. They didn't buy anything, no more computer equipment, every expansion plan, everything just froze. And, so it wasn't even just the venture funded ultimately then, just everybody who stepped back and waited is what it felt like. And so for a business based upon, service, it was an incredible shift in experience, and ultimately 3 employees. And just so we're clear, myself, my father, who by that point joined us as our controller, and 1 staff member.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. The other partners were gone.
Wow.
This this was an incredible year to go through, to survive out of, and to come out standing on the other side of that again.
What ultimately made you decide to keep the business alive after going through something like that's brutal, right? And that's being an entrepreneur itself. I would assume you understand it's a roller coaster, anyways. But then something like this, like that hits your ego and psyche and everything hard, and to want to keep moving forward after that, kind of what was the mindset there?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a combination of different things going on there. One is disbelief.
Yeah.
You're living it in the moment, and you can't believe that it can't be that bad that much further. You can't be worse than this. until
How many times did you say
until it gets worse
that year?
Right. When you go back and you're like, wow, I should have gotten a job at McDonald's. I would have done so much better. And that's when you're in a reflective moment and you look back at that. And I don't mean that in any negative manner. I'm just simply saying I should have worked for somebody else because I could have done so much better. I didn't even need to be at some high level career position. I could have been in the entry level positions that I had at other points in my life.
Yeah.
Where I did work in the hospitality industry. And I would have done better. And I think it's partially that you've invested so much into it. Your blood, sweat, and tears are there. And you've got to shutting down is, in some respects, it is easy just to get up and walk away and say I'm done. But then in many other respects, it's actually a lot of work too.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a stubbornness. A certain amount of stupidity, to be very, very frank.
Yeah.
And then things do start to go back up.
Yeah.
And you do start to grow yourself back out. And by the end of 2002, we were back to 5 employees, and we'd had to right size our infrastructure, our overhead, all the different pieces, and otherwise. And by 2003, we were again doing better, but we had massively shifted who we were as a business. No venture funded, not because I wouldn't have wanted them. It was just it wasn't
the environment
it
anymore.
wasn't they were there. Yeah, it just wasn't there. So we had completely shifted onto being a local IT services company.
Yeah.
Still had the skills of building out global wide area networks, which was part of the business that we were doing in those other years.
Yeah.
Again, going back to my telecommunication time with Case and such. So we still had that, and we still leverage that today. In fact, some of our largest clients, the multinationals in terms of the largest clients, are still based around business that's in that area of space.
Yeah, awesome.
Because we have deep understanding between myself and a number of the others of running a global telecommunication system. So that's part of what we do. But we have great diversity of clients that are in this local space now.
Right.
All right, and so things learned is client diversity. Having 80% of our revenue coming from 2 clients was brutally tragic.
Yeah.
Now we have, we service about 100 clients plus, and there are clients that are larger and smaller, but not any one of them makes up any significant absolute majority of our revenue, so we have a greater diversity. On the negative side, it's a lot of overhead to manage that many clients.
Right.
So some amount of tweaking in between having too much diversity and not enough diversity also has to take place.
And I guess on that note, it's a lot of tightening up your SOPs on the side of when you do have the diversity so you can minimize the overhead, right?
That is true.
Yeah.
And in fact, for us, one of the things we're doing right now in creating efficiencies, and as I mature and the business matures, I now have done different things that recognizing, I think I've been always able to see my faults and my inabilities, but sometimes over the years, I haven't been able to take those into action and correct them in some sort of substantive manner. And in the last 22 years of being effectively leading an organization like this, and in the last 5-6 years, I've turned the corner, I believe, on the fact that I look at it and go, well, you just suck at that. You better get somebody else who does a better job at that.
Whereas before, what would you do? Would you try to acquire that skill yourself?
Yeah, I try to acquire the skill myself. I try to manage my own staff into taking care of it. I would just butt my head against the wall over and over again and get frustrated on why does this person not understand how to get this done? Why do I have to be the one who gets this? And I find myself doing that. I always said, running around the bush over and over again. It wasn't one bush, it was all a series of bushes, and sometimes it was that I would pass by that bush again once a year. I'd be like, damn, I'm here again. How did I get to the same spot again 1 year later?
Yeah.
So learning to stop that. And then part of that also had to do with the fact that I enjoyed being the technician, enjoyed being a capable and knowledgeable individual in the field of IT. I didn't necessarily enjoy the entrepreneurial side of being the financial guy.
Right.
And I also was very customer service oriented, but not marketing and business development focused.
Right.
Because my interest was not as strong in the financial and the business development focus.
Yeah.
And so if I were to go back and roll it back, I'm like, all right, my screw-ups were as much as you'd call them screw-ups. I mean, you always have to balance that against your successes. So maybe the wording should be, the things I would change are focus on the business development first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. All right?
Yeah.
Then everything else, particularly when you're competent and capable in the core line of business, because then that's going to be easy for you.
Yeah.
That's your core line of business. You know it anyway. So if anything goes wrong in that area, you know how to lift the boat back up and out of the water and set it right and get it running in the direction it needs. So that means you really need to put together the other side. And frankly, you don't have a boat if you don't have the business development and the customers coming in. And there's going to be times when you lose and win clients for the strangest and oddest of reasons. And no matter how much effort you make, you're going to lose some of them because management changes. They change their business plan. They get acquired. You're going to have this. And if you don't have a good, constant process on that business development side, and you can never let it stall, and you've got to keep the heart of that portion of the business pumping. Frankly, more important than anything otherwise in the business. Establish, know how to do it, and drive it. And even now, I remind myself of that every single morning because I still don't believe we're doing enough, in that particular area. Because we could be a more successful business. We're a more talented group than what we represent in the market space.
Right.
And I think that is the lack thereof has to do with the that biz dev marketing side.
Yeah. All right. So next place I want to go with our conversation is I'm curious. What do you think are some things people assume about business, but then it turns out to not be correct at all?
I think particularly in the style of business, IT, that we're in, that folks have the impression that there's a lot of money in this space. And while there certainly is, it is a business. I see this type of business, having been in other businesses, really very, very much akin to running a service shop for automobiles or other service-related businesses. I know there are the ventures started, and there's the businesses that have the foosball tables and the slides, and Lord knows I've had plenty of clients who have that sort of thing going on, but that's not all of IT, and those wild margins and becoming crazy rich isn't there for the majority of the business and business owners that I know.
Yeah.
Most of us spend a lot of time grinding away, working hard, trying to maintain profit margins against pressures that come from every different direction, including the county and the state, as well as changes in industry. You have to adapt. To try to maintain those. Yeah. If I just take I wouldn't want somebody to say I'm going into the IT field and I'm just going to, the ad said if I get trained and do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to make X amount of money. Maybe in some cases that is borne out, depending on where you're coming from. But if you think then you're going to start a company and start really raking it in, then I would dissuade folks and tell them that they should really stop and step back more into the vacuum of running a business, not what the service of that business is.
Right.
Because the individual employees at times make more money than the owners do.
Yeah, and I see this kind of inverse relationship between how easy or what kind of business it is and how easy it is to start and the margins of that business. So, you have services, pretty easy to start a services business, relatively speaking, right? But the margins are a lot lower. Products, maybe there's an upfront capital, but in terms of day-to-day running operations, the margin on product is going to be better. And then you have a SaaS software at the top where the margins are nice and fat. And that's where everyone thinks, they probably lump IT in with just all technology in general. Right, but the fact is having a SaaS product or a software as a service product is way different than running an IT company in terms of the people that you need, which most people's expenses are your rent, your lease expense, and your people expenses, right? Those are the largest ones. And when you're running a services company, all of a sudden that balloons a lot.
Yeah, it really is, and you're constantly in a battle to keep that margin. So yeah, it's very, very different. The SaaS business is can be, as we've all seen, it's very, very hit or miss. You can blow it out and do incredibly well, and we all love the stories and read about them, and read Fast Company and all these different articles and stories that are written about these folks who have just done crazy ass stuff, and that is inspirational, interesting. Sometimes it can drive envy. But that's not the experience that I see on a day-to-day business ownership level. I now, in going back to that whole changing who I am in the way I approach my leadership, and finding and recognizing that I need to make changes and bring in the people and the talent. I may have the skills to do that, I just don't have the bandwidth to do it, and I need to recognize that now and not just simply say I'll throw myself into that and fix that myself. And again, that lended itself always to that whole damn I'm passing the same bush again a year later. Is that I threw myself into it, I fixed it, but the fix didn't stick because the standard operating procedures and the processes and otherwise didn't become part of the culture and didn't mature and grow, and so that's changed. I now have a CEO coach, right? And I meet regularly with other CEOs that are part of his group and otherwise, so that we can sit together and talk about the things that we're all facing, even if their businesses are many times larger than my own, or even smaller. Because the issues you just talked about are a moment ago and are universal, and I that's where I find that common space with the gentleman who's doing a residential construction or doing cabinetry or otherwise. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're still having to deal with a lot of the same items, and then it differentiates a little bit. If I look at this particular industry that I'm in, I'm intrigued by the way it operates. I'm intrigued by the way it changes. The way we do business today is different than it was 22 years ago.
Right.
We're still fulfilling a lot of the same services, but how it's executed has changed quite a lot, actually. We've seen margin erosion in areas. Cloud is wonderful, at times over-embraced, in my opinion. I think that's a risk to businesses that a lot of folks don't understand.
Yeah. I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit more. Why do you think? Because everyone's like, the cloud's the best.
I know, and that's why everybody wants to drive into it, because everybody runs around and says the cloud's the best. So if you go back to just around 2000, cloud was, in my opinion, was called ASP, Application Service Provider.
Yeah.
That crapped badly with the whole, I don't know if that's the right words to use, but it went badly for the ASP spaces when the market corrections happened and the bubble burst and otherwise. But they were in fact, as we see now with cloud, following the correct trend.
Yeah.
And that was that you can become very successful if you take a specific product vertical and surround a group of experts who can do it effectively and efficiently and not have to distribute them all across the United States or otherwise. No, I can give my service delivery. I can become a voice over IP service provider out of Tallahassee or otherwise. I don't have to be in the most expensive markets in the world because I can still deliver to those most expensive markets that product. Even therein, there's so much misunderstanding of what's that underlying infrastructure, what does it guarantee and not guarantee. Yeah. And that's the concern place that I have. We're slowly maturing in the terms of the cloud space, but particularly if I look back a few years, I'm like, wow, do we really want to throw away all your basic analysis, the things that being an IT professional over decades was, needs analysis, understanding the process, putting together solutions based upon best fit. There were points at which I felt like that was completely forgotten, and they just screamed the word cloud, and everybody was like, yes. And that was all that happened. Needs and all the rest of it just went away. Don't worry, cloud fixes.
So the assumption is the cloud just takes care of it all.
It does. It must.
Yeah.
And the reality is, you're giving up a lot when you're putting it out into the cloud. You're losing your chain of custody of your most important item, the work product that you've paid your staff to create,
right.
which may remind us all again is the most expensive thing you pay for.
Yeah.
Right? So the work product of these people has now been put where? By whose control? Did you vet the people who are taking care of that?
Yeah.
Just because it says it's Microsoft, does that mean it really is going to be best for you? Let's not forget the fact that if you're a smaller entity compared to Microsoft, a lot of us are smaller entities. Yeah. What do they really owe us if they make a mistake?
Yeah.
In my experience, at least from the agreements that I've read, It's remarkably little.
It's interesting because I think people, and we see this on like the digital ad side too, and just data in general. People scream about their data protection, but their actions say that they don't care about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Right? It really, really is. Cybersecurity, all these things. I love the fact that this is becoming something. Not because I love the fact that that's out there. I love the fact that for decades I could not get even the large multinationals. You could not get the decision makers to focus money, time, and attention. The internet is the most dangerous business tool that we willingly connect ourselves to multiple ways.
Yeah.
Right? If you go back 20 years, theft of what's in your bank accounts happened through either extraordinary circumstances or because you had a employee who took actions that were, let's call them inappropriate.
Unsavory.
Exactly. Or you had other things along those lines.
Yeah.
But they were very local for the most part. And I always try to remind business owners, a consumer account and a corporate account do not have the same banking protections. They're not even remotely the same banking protections. Yeah. And but a lot of small business owners also really don't realize the differentiation and think consumer when they're in corporate, not realizing that corporate account is at a far greater risk. The level of obligation on the part of the bank to return the monies if something has gone wrong is at a completely different place than what we experience at the consumer level. And a lot of folks aren't aware of that, and yet getting them to focus on these things over the years has been very hard. So I'm glad now for maturing of all of this and for folks realizing and being able to have these conversations. Actions still don't follow necessarily the way that they need to. We do spend a lot of time in that education space trying to say, listen, you just took the items that were in your four walls on a local server. And yes, that server would have cost $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 to replace, and you had a capital expenditure with that, however you chose to deal with it. And now you've moved it into an operating expenditure because you're paying AWS or you're paying a service that is using AWS or Azure or any other of these services that are out there. And but now you don't know who these people are who are managing this and who has access to it. And how are you ensuring the safety of this and ensuring that it's yours and you can pull it back and have it back at any time that you like and over again. It's, at a file services level, it's even easy. Then we look at things that are more complex database-driven systems. And how are you pulling all that data? How's that entire wealth of knowledge you put into that SAP-based database or otherwise going to come back out to you? How do you even reconstruct quickly if there's a problem that they're going to bring it back online? I know they pledged that, but if they miss the pledge, what's the real cost to them versus what's the real cost to you as a business?
Right.
And there's a huge misalignment there, but it's not paid attention to a lot.
Yeah.
That being said, I'm in complete support of what was the ASP model and that cloud model and all of this because it does make complete business sense.
Yeah. But you need that needs analysis and that risk analysis to make sure there's alignment.
You still have to go back. You still have to think about these things. It's fine to be a consumer, but eyes wide open, right? And the simple example I often give folks is Vonage is a brilliant business. Mm-hmm. But it was also, I personally call it a little dishonest in their marketing because they encouraged you to throw away your Verizon telephone line or otherwise. But the Verizon telephone line came with service assurances that Vonage does not. Right. Now Vonage came with features that Verizon didn't come with, and I appreciate that too. Yeah. So there's a value in these things, but the problem is that my belief is that a significant amount of the consumer base, at least when they originally stepped in, maybe they learned it over time. Yeah. But when they originally stepped in, didn't realize what they were giving up on the one hand for the other hand. Right. And I even see that within the IT community, and I even see folks in the IT community at other what I guess would be peers in this space taking their large corporate law offices or otherwise down paths where I look at it and I'm like, wow, as an outside IT consultant, I could never do that because if it went bad, they'd look at me and say, you took us down this path.
Right.
Whereas the internal IT person does this and he's like, well, Verizon messed us up, or otherwise it points the other direction.
Yeah.
Right? So they get away with it. And that's, in some respects, how there's been a lot of growth in areas where I'm like, wow, that's a bit of a risky model to do that in a cloud service. But, then they do well and they get away with it. So kudos to them.
Do you think there's going to be any major backlash, or is this just, a hedging your risk type where you're coming at from it? Or do you think there will be, or has there been instances where people have been screwed over by, the protections that they thought were afforded that weren't?
For sure. I mean, I've had cases. I mean, voice again is always an easy one to go to because voice is ridiculously tiny in terms of its needs and bandwidth needs and otherwise, but it's super sensitive. And we've all experienced bad phone calls, and we've experienced bad cellular phone calls. And what you haven't realized is that most of your most of your cell towers are probably VoIP backhauling, and so you think you had a bad cell connection, and what you didn't realize is that they messed up the VoIP backhaul, but you didn't differentiate the two.
Right.
For you, it just sounded like an echoey call.
Yeah.
Those calls that we have where, you say something, then I start to say something, then we realize we stepped on each other and the latency comes up too high, and otherwise, that very likely can be on the VoIP backhaul and not actually on the cell connection between your phone and that cell. Or it could be also there too, but it's hard to say, so they can get away with it.
Right.
And we've also gotten desensitized to it. Right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of growth in IT from where I started at into, it's good enough.
Right.
It is.
Yeah.
We've reset our bars, even at a corporate level, we've reset our bars over and over again. And part of the resetting of the bars is also because the demand of the leadership, ownership, and decision makers is also kind of like, it was good enough.
Yeah.
And then you come into IT and you show the cost between this is where we are and this is where we could be. And they're like, that's good enough.
Yeah.
So I continue to see more of that. I see maturing of the systems. I think they are going to take away some of the things where I have places of concern. I see that happening through smart intelligence of applications, of tool sets, SD-WAN. Is a smart implementation of using a variety of different tool sets to balance and create a balance between I need to have a dedicated private network for my global corporation and, oh my God, that's ridiculously expensive compared to at home I get a Comcast connection that's 5 times as fast and a fraction of that cost. Why can't the business have that? Right. And you can now merge these things and use them, and that's a maturing process, and that's an intelligence, and us going back and looking at it going, well, why can't I have the best of both worlds? How do I apply that? And, and then that fixes I gotta send certain traffic down the private network because it's unsafe to send it other ways, or it isn't conducive to sending it the other way, but I still can use both in the manner that I choose, and more things like that. That's what I see happening in the future. Continued smart applications that change how we interact with one another, both at the business level. We see it constantly with intelligent tools like Slack and Microsoft now Teams. That's dimensionally changing how we do business. Yeah. I know it's dimensionally changing our clients do business. Yeah. So I see more and more, for every one of these that develops into a really smart tool, you see plenty of them that nearly got there, or they cast offside or otherwise. But I see that just continuing and changing how we do business, and then changing the greater landscape, which we're all experiencing, right? Yeah. I don't need a bigger office because I'm totally fine to let folks choose to work from where they want to work from, as long as they don't have to physically hands-on to, a particular object or otherwise to execute their work, then, so I just see more and more of that. What I continue to, for our own business, look at is for that telecom background. Mm-hmm. For me, I was trying to, I wrote our first business plans. They weren't called MSP, we called it M&S. back in 99 and 2000. Because what I was trying to do was look at the efficiencies that I saw in the telecommunications industry, the Verizons and otherwise, where they put the high dollar, most expensive senior engineers into a single centralized place. And we weren't doing that in IT. The high dollar people were going on site and were going out all over the place. And that kills you in traffic and otherwise. So to bring IT to the corporations in a model that had been over decades perfected by the telecommunications industry was my merging into what I called M&S.
Okay.
And then in the years that happened, many other people obviously had the same thoughts, and the industry called MSP developed around that and tool sets to it.
Okay.
For me, in our industry, I see the developing further and further of that, where we again continue to have the experts who don't come necessarily to you, but can give you everything you need more cost effectively from remote, just increasing to a higher and higher level as part of the development of what I see in our industry.
Awesome. And so I guess what's next for digital industry? Where do you see, I guess what's your focus over, let's say we're in 2020 now, and where do you see you guys in particular, heading and focusing over the next year?
I think for us, a big part of the focus is that managed services side that I just spoke of, but adding in and maturing our systems and services. I already feel like we're well ahead on that comparative to a lot of the other companies like ourselves in the market space, because we're already working to integrate in all these other cybersecurity components or otherwise. For instance, a lot of our competitors I know still do cybersecurity or firewall management or otherwise based upon, I know what I'm doing, don't worry, business owner, I got you taken care of, I put a firewall in for you. Whereas we're at a different place with that. That's your baseline. As far as we're concerned, at this point, all businesses should be starting to focus on have mature processes. In a lot of businesses don't. And what I mean by this is they don't have your user policies put together, and you need your user policies because you do need to guide your user bases so that they use the equipment that you're supplying them and the knowledge and the tools and the work effort that they're producing, and that they put it in the correct place. It doesn't go in Dropbox. It should go in OneDrive. It shouldn't go in OneDrive. It goes in SharePoint. If you don't communicate this all around and have it as part of your SOPs and as part of your processes, then all of your corporate knowledge bleeds into all these little cracks and crevices all over the place. So I see guidance in those areas that we provide to our clients. We provide documents that guide them along. There are wonderful documents being written by NIST, like their 800-171 standards on cybersecurity or otherwise. That's where the bedrock we need to be in an IT professionals laying our heads against, not on handshakes of saying, don't worry, I put a sonic wall out there for you. Yeah. It needs to come from places of thoughtfulness so that you sit down with your client and say, there's a holistic side to security of the company. It isn't just who can get into your place from Georgia, the state, or the country. That's the danger of being connected to the internet, both by your phone, by your office, and running your telephones over it. That has to be continually considered because it is the most dangerous tool we connect ourselves to. Yeah. That allows now anybody to get into your bank accounts if you do the wrong things. Yeah. Which goes back to the earlier statements of before we had to worry about local things. You didn't give the bookkeeper didn't give the bookkeeper signatory right, and that went a long way into making sure money didn't walk out of your bank account. Right. You separated those items. A lot of businesses, when they went into digital banking, were like, well, obviously we don't need those protections anymore, and so the bookkeeper is able to transfer money in and out and otherwise. Cyber criminals around the world know this. Yeah. And they go after the bookkeepers, and they go after the business owners, and they intentionally, and on top of everything else, we willingly post who we are. Right. Right? So they just have to go into LinkedIn and be like, all right, that company's obviously making that money, and we're going to go after these people because these people have the keys to the bank accounts and otherwise. So all of that posts, so those are the things that I see us as a business, as an industry, continuing to work with our clients on to make sure they understand where the demarcations lie between what the bank's responsibility is and what the corporation's responsibility is, and setting those all up into a structured and intelligent manner, which is truly a change in who we were when we were building PCs, which is part of how we started. Yeah. 20 years ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as technology advances, there's going to naturally be this knowledge gap because other small business owners, professionals, they just can't keep up with this knowledge on their own, and having you guys come in and be the ones to educate on them to fill in that gap becomes more and more important as things continue to advance, and it's only going to get wider, that knowledge gap. So I love that that's a big focus for you guys coming in and educating people on what they should be doing.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I really appreciate this. This was incredible. Your story is fantastic. I really appreciate you coming out, or we came out to you, but I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk. I got a lot out of it. I know Vlad behind the camera there, I know he liked it, and I hope we could do a part 2 at some point because this was fantastic, and I know we could dive even deeper.
I appreciate it, and as I said as we started, I have a lot of interest in seeing in these directions. I do recognize the importance of being able to communicate the messages.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.